The morning air felt heavy, as if the city itself knew Daniel's life had collapsed overnight. Papers covered the kitchen table like autumn leaves after a storm. Daniel said, "It's gone. Everything's gone." The words cut through the silence. His phone vibrated again, another payment reminder. He stared at the digital screen as if it were mocking him. His wife's voice broke from the hallway. "Daniel, what's happening?" But he couldn't answer. His chest tightened with a pressure that felt older than yesterday's news. The coffee on the counter had gone cold, untouched since dawn. He thought about the years spent climbing, believing hard work was the ladder, only to discover it was a treadmill. Outside, the first buses of the day hissed along wet streets, oblivious to the ruins inside this small apartment. Daniel whispered to himself, "They don't want us to know. They never did." And in that moment, the truth hit him harder than the loss. The system had been designed this way. The apartment walls felt closer than they had yesterday, as if space itself was shrinking. Daniel stood at the window, watching the rain smear the city into watercolor grays. His reflection stared back at him, tired, lined, and older than his years. He thought about the promises made in college classrooms, about how success was just a matter of discipline. "They never told us the rules," he muttered. Behind him, the sound of his wife quietly packing a lunchbox echoed like a metronome. It wasn't anger he felt, but a hollow kind of grief, the slow erosion of belief. He remembered his father saying, "If you don't learn how money works, money will work you." Back then it sounded like a warning from another time. Now it was prophecy. The bills hadn't moved from the table. Daniel couldn't bring himself to touch them. He stared at the red ink like it was bleeding into his future. "It's not just numbers," he whispered. "It's chains." The radio in the corner played a morning finance segment, cheerful voices describing record market highs. He turned it off mid-sentence. The silence that followed felt heavier. Memories of late nights working overtime, skipping family dinners, all came flooding back, each sacrifice now feeling like a trick played by the world. He clenched his fists, not in rage, but in desperate resolve. Something had to change. Daniel sat back, rubbing his temples. Outside, the rain softened, but the air felt no lighter. His wife walked past with the lunchbox, pausing for a moment. "We'll figure it out," she said, forcing a smile. He nodded, though the truth weighed heavier than any words could carry. He wanted to tell her everything, the hidden debts, the missed payments, but instead he said nothing. His silence wasn't protection, it was surrender. Somewhere deep down, he knew this was how people lost themselves, not in one blow, but in 1,000 small concessions to fear. By the time the door closed behind her, Daniel was already pacing. The apartment felt too small to contain the weight in his chest. He stopped by the table, picked up a single bill, and read the date aloud. 3 days. His voice cracked. He looked at the fridge, at the family photo taken on a vacation they couldn't afford, paid for on credit. The smile in that picture now felt like a lie they had told themselves. He pressed his forehead against the cold metal door, listening to the hum, wondering if this was the sound of a life being measured in dwindling time. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened, reflecting the dull gray sky. Daniel walked briskly, hands deep in his pockets, the wind biting through his thin jacket. The world moved as if nothing had happened, as if his collapse was invisible. He passed a bank branch, its glass facade gleaming with posters promising financial freedom. He muttered, "Freedom for who?" His steps slowed, eyes fixed on the smiling faces in the advertisements. They looked untouched by reality. He remembered applying for his first loan here, the crisp suits, the confident handshake. He thought they were on his side. Now, the very sight of the building made his stomach tighten. Inside a small cafe, Daniel sat with a black coffee, steam curling in the dim light. Across from him, his old friend Marco leaned forward, whispering about the real game of money. "They don't teach this in school," Marco said, his eyes sharp. Daniel listened, torn between curiosity and disbelief. Marco spoke of leverage, hidden fees, and how the system feeds on ignorance. Daniel sipped his coffee slowly, each word feeling heavier than the last. "So you're saying it's all rigged?" Daniel asked. Marco just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that said more than words could. Marco pulled out a folded napkin and began sketching lines, boxes, and arrows. "This is how they move money," he said. Daniel's eyes followed the pen like it was tracing a secret map. The drawing looked chaotic at first, but patterns began to emerge, debt flowing upward, profits trickling down. "We're at the bottom," Marco added. Daniel felt the weight of those words press against him like a tide. It wasn't just his debt, it was everyone's. The napkin looked too small to hold something so big. By midday, Daniel found himself wandering through a park, the winter air sharp in his lungs. Parents pushed strollers, joggers passed by, children laughed in the distance. The normalcy felt surreal. He sat on a bench, staring at his phone screen, scrolling through overdue notices. A child's laughter drifted closer, and he glanced up to see a boy kicking a worn soccer ball. For a brief moment, Daniel remembered his own childhood, before bills, before the wait. The sound of an incoming call broke the memory. The bank again. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table again, the bills still there, as if they had been waiting. He unfolded Marco's napkin, tracing the lines with his finger. The design looked less like a map and more like a trap. "If this is true," he thought, "then they've been winning from the start." He felt a strange mix of anger and clarity. The game wasn't about earning more. It was about knowing the rules. But learning the rules meant facing things he had spent years avoiding. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the decision forming inside his mind. Daniel's laptop glowed in the dark, the only light in the apartment. His fingers tapped hesitantly, searching for terms Marco had mentioned. Offshore accounts, tax shelters, predatory lending. Each click led deeper into a world that felt hidden on purpose. "They speak a different language," he murmured. The screen filled with charts and acronyms designed to confuse. He realized this wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. If no one understands the rules, no one can win. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from the slow burn of understanding. A bookmarked article described the 2008 collapse in sterile terms: market correction, liquidity crisis, but Daniel saw only families losing home. He remembered a neighbor packing a moving van in the rain. "We all thought it was bad luck," he whispered. The truth felt heavier now. The system hadn't broken, it had worked exactly as designed. Those at the top walked away richer, while the rest rebuilt from ashes. The words blurred on the screen, but the meaning was clear. He pushed the laptop away and stood, pacing. The air felt too still. His mind replayed Marco's words, "They don't teach this in school." He thought about every class he'd taken, every financial tip from TV, all built to keep him thinking small. He opened the fridge, staring blankly at the dim light inside. Food for a week, maybe. Money for less. He closed the door slowly, the hum loud in the silence. "This isn't living," he said. Daniel returned to the table, pulling a worn notebook from a drawer. Inside were pages of budgets from years past, careful handwriting, precise numbers. He flipped through them, seeing the years when they cut vacations, skipped repairs, took extra shifts. Every sacrifice had been swallowed whole by interest rates and fees. He slammed the notebook shut. "We've been playing defense our whole lives," he thought. The realization stung more than the debt itself. The city outside glittered like a promise he no longer believed. Daniel stood by the window, watching the lights flicker in office towers. Somewhere in those rooms people made decisions that shaped lives like his, and they never saw the faces they affected. He clenched his fists in his pockets. This wasn't just about paying off debt anymore. It was about seeing the game for what it was, and deciding whether to keep playing by their rules. Daniel sat in the library, surrounded by stacks of books on finance, economics, and history. The quiet felt heavy, as though the walls themselves held secrets. He traced a finger down a page about corporate lobbying, the words striking harder than he expected. Entire laws had been shaped to benefit a few, while the rest were told to work harder. His phone buzzed with a text from Marco. Found something. Meet tonight. Daniel's pulse quickened. He didn't know it yet, but the rules of his life were about to be rewritten. The diner was nearly empty when Daniel slid into the booth across from Marco. Marco's eyes darted toward the door before leaning in. You ever wonder why your loan rates never dropped, even when the market did? Daniel frowned, unsure where this was going. Marco slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were printouts of transactions tied to Daniel's own bank, loans bundled and sold off to investors. His name was buried in the paperwork like a footnote to a fortune he'd never see. Daniel scanned the pages, his throat dry. Each line confirmed it. His debt wasn't just a burden, it was a product, traded like stock. They've been making money off me losing, he said quietly. Marco nodded. Off all of us. The background hum of the diner faded under the weight of the words. Daniel felt a mix of rage and clarity that made the room feel sharper. The game wasn't just rigged, it was personal. They left the diner, the night air cold and biting. Marco lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. This is why I got out, he said. Daniel's steps were heavy, his mind replaying every bill, every late notice. Each had been fuel for someone else's gain. He looked up at the skyline. The glittering towers, no longer symbols of aspiration, but of extraction. The truth had weight, but it also had direction. He knew now who the enemy was. Back home, Daniel spread the documents across his table. The bills looked different now, not just demands, but proof of a bigger machine at work. He whispered, "They've been selling my struggle." His voice was steady, not broken. For the first time, he didn't feel like a victim. The fight ahead would be long, maybe impossible, but he had seen the hidden map. And once you see the map, you can't go back to being lost. Daniel barely slept, his mind pacing long after his body had stopped. The ceiling above him seemed to press down with the weight of decisions he could no longer postpone. By morning, there was no hesitation left, only a steady simmering purpose. The air in the apartment was cold, his breath faintly visible in the kitchen as he stood by the counter, the printer spitting out each sheet Marco had given him. The sound of the machine felt like a drumbeat before battle. He stacked the pages neatly, the paper crisp and heavy in his hands, smelling faintly of fresh ink. At the counter, he whispered his lines, each sentence sharpening like a blade. "You've been selling my debt for profit," he said under his breath, practicing until the words felt natural, until his voice carried steel instead of doubt. The clock read 8:12 a.m. He slipped the stack into a worn manila folder, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside. The street air was brittle, the kind that cracks against your skin, and for the first time in weeks, he wasn't walking away from something, he was walking toward it. The bank's lobby felt like another world, warm, spotless, and carefully designed to suit. Polished marble floors reflected soft golden light from recessed fixtures, and the faint scent of coffee and new carpet hung in the air. Daniel's shoes clicked against the floor, the sound magnified in the quiet. A young teller in a navy blazer smiled politely, the practiced warmth of someone trained to be both friendly and impenetrable. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice a polished script. Daniel set the folder on the counter with deliberate weight, the sound cutting through the gentle hum of the space. "You can start by explaining this," he said, sliding it toward her. She glanced down, her expression flickering almost imperceptibly before she schooled it back into neutrality. The lobby's atmosphere remained calm, but Daniel could feel a shift in the air, a faint tightening, as though the room itself had noticed him. A manager appeared from a side hallway, his suit pressed to perfection, tie knotted with mathematical precision. His smile was measured, his tone smooth as polished glass. "Why don't we step into my office, Mr. Reyes?" Daniel followed, noting the quiet efficiency with which the door was closed behind them. The office had glass walls, but felt sealed, insulated from the rest of the building. Daniel placed the folder on the desk and spread the documents like cards in a high-stakes game. These loans were packaged and sold. My name is on them. Tell me, how much did you make? The manager's smile tightened but did not fade. Mr. Reyes, I think you're misunderstanding. Daniel cut him off, his voice a low, sharp edge. No. I finally understand. I understand exactly how you've been making your money. The words hung between them, heavy and electric, the silence that followed more telling than any denial. The conversation sharpened like a blade on stone. The manager leaned back, speaking in the jargon of detachment, industry standard, portfolio optimization, risk management. Each phrase felt like a wall being built between truth and accountability. Daniel didn't blink. You profit when I lose. That's not an opinion. That's a fact, he said, his voice carrying the weight of weeks of bottled frustration. The manager's eyes flicked toward the glass walls, where a few employees had slowed their steps, their attention drawn to the tension in the air. Daniel caught it, that split-second fracture in the man's composure. It wasn't much, just the faintest narrowing of eyes, a quick swallow before speaking again. But it was enough to tell Daniel that he had landed a blow. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as though the truth itself was pressing in. Daniel left the bank without promises, without settlements, but not without victory. The icy air outside hit him like a jolt, waking muscles he hadn't realized were tense. The folder was tucked under his arm, lighter now, though the papers inside were unchanged. He walked down the street with a different weight, not the slump of someone being chased by debt, but the forward lean of someone advancing toward a fight. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be quick or clean. They had resources, lawyers, and power that could crush him without noticing. But he also knew something they couldn't take back. He had found his voice. Today, he had looked into the face of the machine and made it listen, even for a moment. And once you stop being silent, silence becomes impossible. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the documents spread wide, covering the surface like a cartographer's chart. Morning light spilled through the blinds in pale stripes, striping the papers with gold and shadow. He could hear the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of a neighbor's radio somewhere above him. The city outside was just beginning to stir. But here, everything felt suspended, a quiet pocket in the rush of morning. He worked slowly, marking pages with sticky notes, drawing lines between dates, names, and amounts. The lines grew into a web, and the web grew into a story, one that didn't end at his doorstep. He thought of Marco's words. If you learn the rules, you can choose how to play. For the first time, Daniel felt the strange, stubborn satisfaction of building something they hadn't meant for him to see. The realization settled deep. Knowledge wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon, and today he was arming himself. The cafe felt like a pocket of warmth against the winter chill. The air was thick with the scent of espresso, the hiss of steaming milk punctuating the low murmur of conversations. Daniel sat at their usual table, the one near the window where condensation fogged the glass. He placed a folder on the table with deliberate care, the weight of it a quiet statement. Marco arrived moments later, shrugging off his coat, the familiar scent of cigarette smoke clinging faintly to it. "It's bigger than I thought," Daniel said as Marco flipped open the folder. Inside, his own research layered over Marco's original findings, timelines, transactions, names. Marco's brow furrowed, then lifted, a flicker of impressed surprise. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low, but edged with something like approval. Daniel leaned forward. "If they've been selling me, they've been selling everyone." The truth settled between them like a third presence at the table. That evening, the apartment was quiet except for the faint click of keys. Daniel sat at his laptop, not lost in an aimless search this time, but building something precise. Scanned documents slid into digital folders, timelines were tightened, names connected. The cursor blinked in a draft email addressed to a journalist he'd followed for years, someone known for dragging banking secrets into the light. His hands hovered above the keyboard. Sending this would mean stepping into a storm. There could be consequences, legal, personal, financial. He imagined phone calls at night, letters from lawyers, cold stares from strangers in suits. But the alternative, silence, felt heavier. He began typing, fingers steady, the words deliberate and free of hesitation. This wasn't about venting. This was about evidence. About planting a fuse and deciding to light it. The moment came and went with a single keystroke. The send icon pulsed, then vanished, the email shooting off into the invisible highways of the internet. Daniel leaned back, his chair creaking under the shift of weight. Outside, the city's night lights blinked in slow rhythm, indifferent to the small act that could ignite something larger. He let the silence settle, his pulse matching the steady thrum of the refrigerator. For weeks, his chest had carried a tightness, a pressure that had kept his shoulders bowed. Now there was space, not relief exactly, but the stillness of the eye of a storm. He knew the winds would return, stronger, but for this moment there was calm. He closed his eyes briefly, letting it sink in. There was no going back. The morning light was soft, almost hesitant, when his phone buzzed on the table. Daniel picked it up, the screen glowing with an email notification. He tapped it open and read, "Let's talk." Just 2 words, but they landed like a gavel. He read them again, then set the phone down slowly, staring at it, as though it might speak more. Around him, the apartment was unchanged. The bills still sat stacked on the counter, the fridge hummed, the blinds swayed faintly in the draft. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer a fight carried alone. Somewhere out there, another set of eyes was on this. Another voice might soon join his. He exhaled through his nose, feeling the slow, deliberate thud of his heartbeat. Momentum, fragile, dangerous and alive, had found its way into the room. The cafe was louder than usual, filled with the clink of porcelain cups and the low hum of Saturday conversations. Yet for Daniel, the sound faded beneath the voice in his earbud, clear and measured against the background noise. On the other end was the journalist, her tone calm but edged with urgency. "Are you sure you want to go on record?" she asked. Daniel's eyes drifted across the room. Strangers bent over their phones, steam rising from coffee cups, the muted hiss of the espresso machine. None of them knew that a story was unfolding at the far corner table, one that could ripple far beyond this space. "Yes," Daniel said, his voice steady, carrying no hesitation. "If I stay quiet, I'm just another line in their ledger." The words felt like they belonged to someone older, someone sharper, but he recognized them as his own. There was a pause on the line, then a softer shift in the journalist's voice, almost like respect. "Then let's get to work," she replied. And just like that, the next step was no longer a question. Back at the apartment, Daniel stood for a long moment at the edge of his kitchen table, just looking at it. For weeks, it had been buried under an avalanche of unopened envelopes, half-empty coffee cups, and the quiet chaos of defeat. Now, it was clear, a bare, polished surface waiting for purpose. He began laying out the documents in clean, deliberate rows. No more clutter, no more piles leaning dangerously on one another. Each sheet had its place, each name and date visible. He photographed them carefully, the click of the shutter becoming a rhythm in the stillness. He labeled files on his laptop, cross-referenced details, checked them twice. Outside, clouds pressed low, filtering the light until the lamp above him carved the room into warm amber and deep shadow. As he sealed a padded envelope for the journalist, he realized the feeling in his chest wasn't the pounding fear that had kept him frozen for so long. It was something steadier. The grounded resolve of a man preparing for a fight on his own terms. Night descended slowly, the city outside glowing in fragments. A window here, a flicker of neon there. Daniel stood at the window, his reflection framed against the dark glass. He thought about every choice that had brought him to this point, the extra shifts he'd worked without complaint, the times he'd stayed silent rather than ask questions, the years he'd believed the system was something you could win by following the rule. Fairness had been a story, not a truth. And stories could be rewritten. In his reflection, he noticed something unfamiliar, not the tired lines at the corners of his eyes, but a sharpness in his gaze, a steel edge that hadn't been there before. It wasn't hope, exactly, and it wasn't rage. It was something harder to break: defiance. Outside, the first drops of rain began to slide down the glass, catching the glow of the city lights like tiny sparks in the dark. Daniel's voice was quiet but certain as he told his reflection, "They're not ready for me." The morning broke under a pale sky, soft and muted, as if the day itself were cautious. Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter, the sound cutting through the quiet. He picked it up, thumb unlocking the screen to reveal a single new email. The subject line was short: "Let's talk." He read it twice, the words sinking into him like a sudden drop in temperature. He imagined the journalist on the other end, already planning, already pulling at the threads of the story. Somewhere in a boardroom, he pictured executives leaning over conference tables, voices sharp, hands moving over spreadsheets. Somewhere else, lawyers drafted statements, polished and hollow. He set the phone down beside his coffee mug, steam curling into the still air. The bills still sat on the counter. Nothing material had changed. And yet, the room felt altered, charged. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone in the fight. The weight in his chest shifted, not gone but shared. That night, Daniel sat in the living room, the only light coming from the television screen. The news anchor's voice was calm, but the images were not: charts, timelines and industry terms being explained in plain language. They didn't say his name, but his work was in every frame. The documents, the patterns, the hidden trades, all there, reframed for the world to see. Daniel watched in stillness, not smiling, not celebrating, just absorbing. Somewhere, someone like him was seeing this, and realizing they weren't crazy, that the game wasn't fair, and that it could be questioned. The segment ended, the anchor's face replaced by the evening weather. Daniel reached for the remote, switching the TV off, letting the room sink into darkness. Outside, the rain had stopped, the streets shining under the glow of street lamps. He sat for a moment longer, his eyes adjusting to the quiet. The final thought came not as a whisper, but as a certainty. Once you see the game for what it is, you can never unsee it.